So it's such a good question. And the answer is not going to be, my first answer is not going to be a surprise for you because you say it all the time, plan for it. So when I've been involved in crisis going into change before, I've been involved in tons of crisis planning, tabletop exercises, all that sort of stuff, which is fabulous for the initial crisis. But then it's like, okay, so what does it look like afterwards? So, and again, it can get quite tactical. It can get into well, we need to put these people here and the logistics of all that sort of stuff. But then it's also considering the plan for the response and the recovery afterwards about how are people going to feel about this? What are we going to tell them? How are we going to shift from one state to another? I'll come on to that in a minute. And that recovery phase, I'd love to get your thoughts on this at some point, but that recovery phase is quite often overlooked in terms of the people and the impacts of it. And it can go on for ages before you trip into a sort of change process. So I think that's the first thing, is the plan. The second thing is thinking about it as that transition. So in organisational change, I quite often talk about the work of William Bridges, and I can send you the link for this, who has a book called Managing Transitions. And he talks about 3 stages. So you've got the ending. So this is saying goodbye almost to what's gone. A neutral phase where people are kind of moving into whatever the new beginning is. But that neutral phase is really important because it's where people can get a bit lost. And then obviously that new beginning bit. So there's new ways of doing things and a level of optimism. But if we think about it in phases and transition, is what are people letting go of? So even in a crisis, and we've seen it with the pandemic, we got used to the way of doing stuff. So taking people out of that into a different phase is really important, that we're understanding. So it's being really intentional really about it and not just letting it drift around. So it goes back to that bit again about planning. And then there's another piece here about thinking where people are and their response to what's going on. So, and that includes you, if you're leading it, if you're communicating about it, because you get impacted. I think sometimes we think that leaders and managers are like over there and none of this, they're like Teflon, none of it's hitting them, but actually it's impacting them as much. And that can get a delayed reaction if we're too involved in what's going on right now. So it's almost, how can we step out a bit, look at the emotional impact of it? Because negative stress, we can't really sustain that for too long. And crisis, if we're not careful, we can tip quite quickly into that negative stress state. So they're my sort of three things. So communication for me, when we go through, and this is your bag, so the crisis communication is that whole clarity, setting direction, making sure that everybody's clear. And that doesn't change really after crisis. And that's this planning piece. If we do that well, what does that look like? What are we intentionally planning for? So when it shifts into a change or we're in the recovery piece, it's about setting that clarity and giving people a sense of direction. So, and I talked previously about bridges. If you're in that neutral phase, it's how do we help people understand what comes next? Even if we don't know what that is, we've got a signpost to say, this is when we're going to be able to work out what it is. If we can do that in conjunction with people, then even better. So what's the learning been from the crisis, for example, and really try and get that engagement. And that helps to keep disruption down, because in a vacuum after a crisis and moving into recovery and change, people will create their own reality. And if you don't communicate, someone else will do it for you. And then I did some research back in 2021 with about 13 leaders talking about what wellbeing and resilience looks like in organisational change. Communication came up in every single one of those conversations about that clarity, understanding, reducing anxiety, and it's that expectation setting. And the one that really struck me when I was thinking about our conversation is about hybrid working. So it kind of got forced into that in the pandemic. A lot of organisations were already doing it, but a lot of organisations got really shoved into it. That's still going. So in an ideal world, after the immediacy of looking at hybrid working, it's then exploring through a communication process, what does this look like? What's worked well? What can we take forward? And then communicating what you're going to do about that. So again, it's that clarity all the way through. And there'll be tons of reflection space if you allow that to happen. So it's making sure that that comes in. So I read something about Google last month. Their head of people was saying that they're now going to kind of reinforce their hybrid working model to get people into the office 3 times a week. And I think they've got evidence now that they can see that collaborative working has been helping to develop innovation, basically, by having people in together. So again, that evidence base that you can share through comms is really important.
Yeah, it's interesting you were talking about, obviously, about planning, which I'm kind of very passionate about, getting ahead of things. And you talked about the exercises you've been involved in, but they all tend to focus on that first bit of crisis emerging. So are there things like exercises or whatever that practically you would think we should look at for recovery phase?
Yeah, there's things like, so those tabletop exercises would be a brilliant example. So when I've been in those, it's been about the governance piece, about who hands over to who, about and who's communicating what levels are doing what sign-offs and all. Brilliant, great in the moment, exactly as you've said. So what can you take from that into the recovery phase? And it's exactly that. So what are you going to take? What exercises? So some of the things that you could take from that, for example, is who's going to be holding the pen almost for our ongoing communication in recovery? What does that look like? And it may be that it switches to somebody else. It may be that your recovery team doesn't look the same as the crisis team. And how's that going to move forward? How are you going to communicate that? So there's exercises that we can take from the tabletop exercise, the crisis, the initial piece, into that recovery phase, but really thinking holistically about the communication strategy about that, the messaging, the who, the channels, but not getting too granular before we've decided what that really looks like at a higher level. So I know that you talk about 4 R's, don't you? 4 R's of recovery. And I've got some R's as well. So resource, planet, said it before, just the gazillion learning about the pandemic, about recovering from a crisis, is thinking about the recovery bit and remembering that recovery and moving into change isn't like days and weeks. It can be months and years, because we're still seeing the knock-on impacts of the pandemic, which create mini crises in themselves. So it's just remembering that, and then regrouping. So keep regrouping, keep looking at what's happening, and keep sort of almost pivoting, but shifting how you're doing stuff and checking in with each other as to what your plan is to move forward. And that's at a leadership, management, comms team, anything level. Keep talking. Resilience is a massive one from me, and thinking about things from a healthy individual, a team, and an organizational level, and keep your eye on yourself and other people as well. We can't keep operating in crisis mode all the time. We're not designed for that. And there's a thing called the pressure performance curve, which is like a bell curve. And if we stay too far, at one side you've got boredom, and at the other side you've got sort of crisis. If we stay too far, and we'll just burn out, and we can't do that. So we've got an optimum level of pressure, and it's different for each of us. So recognizing that and just looking after ourselves, really. And then as part of that, and it fits into the planning piece, is active resilience. And this I picked up from, again, another link I'll share, from a book called Stop, Ask, Explore by a lady called Joan Ball. And it's about preparation to be resilient. So thinking about what's in my gift, what agency have I got to make things different? So really thinking about that. And then the final one is self-awareness, self-care, top thing. Just think about yourself, think about everybody, and be clear. Just try to be as clear as you can and don't get caught in the weeds. I think probably the pandemic has really put the spotlight on crisis, recovery, and change as three separate things almost. I've been involved in projects where I've been brought in on the change piece as a result of a crisis coming through. So either a response to a market change or whatever. And it's really interesting to see that if you get into a change program or project without having done the crisis bit well, the recovery piece well, and the review and the reflection piece well, you've got a bunch of knackered people starting on something that they can't see what they've learned. So that review piece is so important, and just making sure that you've got that resilience underpinning everything.